Hello, today's book talk will be about The Killer Shadow, written by both John Douglas, who was a former FBI agent, and Mark Oshaker, who is a filmmaker, journalist, and an author. Our main focus in this book is about a white supremacist killer, so this book is true crime. Our white supremacist killer is named James Clayton Vaughn Jr., or until he later changed it to Joseph Paul Franklin. I will be referring to him as Mr. Franklin. So Mr. Franklin was brought up in a very abusive household. His father would often get drunk. And take most of the beatings on Mr. Franklin. His mother Helen was a daughter of Nazi supporters, which didn't help with the white supremacists. He grew up with Caroline Lester, Marilyn Garson, and his younger brother Gordon Vaughn. Again, he was brought in a very abusive household, and with the ideologies of being with a Nazi supporting family, he of course would also follow that path. He at the age of 17-18 would join the Nazi Party and the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, which after he joined, he ended up dropping high school. And just 2 weeks later, he gets married to Miss Bobby Lewis. But 10 months later, he gets divorced. He gets divorced because, just as his father would be Mr. Franklin would be his wife. So this book is mostly about Mr. Franklin's killings, what his thought process was, or how the FBI agent would see Mr. Franklin, Franklin's trials, and hunting down Mr. Franklin, because Mr. Franklin was all over the United States. So one of his earliest sorry, I didn't mention an important part. As we talked, he was part of the KKK and the neo-Nazi Nazi Party. Those ideologies made him very anti-Jewish and did not like African Americans at all, because that is what he grew up with. And he would unfortunately kill anyone who was associated with, mostly women, with African American men and Jewish people. It just didn't matter at all. So one of the first killings that we are introduced to is the Liberty Park shooting. So Liberty Park shooting, there was a group of people on a jogging. There were two black people, which were Terry and David, along with Mark and Todd. Todd and Mark were white, while Terry and David were not. They were going on a jog when, on the west loop of the park, Terry was shot first, shot twice actually. There were many witnesses, and one of them, out of the four boys, one of them didn't survive, unfortunately. Terry, David, and Todd were shot. He was a prime suspect for this killing. Um, Before I go any further, this book talks about the MO and signature. Well, the MO is usually how the victim kills. Like, you would describe it as the weapon of choice. In this case, Mr. Franklin's weapon of choice was a high-powered rifle, and would often shoot afar. He did not care. He was not emotionally interested in his victims, which made it sad for the other victims, for the victims' families, because they had, the victims had families. Like this one case Daryl and Danny, I believe, were walking to the candy store. They were 15, and they were both shot dead. Daryl died at the crime scene. Unfortunately, his father, who was a paramedic, his team was the first to be at the scene, but unfortunately, Daryl did not make it. While the other boy was in a critical condition. And I talked about the signature, and the signature is usually what the unsub or Mr. Franklin targeted. I talked about it. He would target Jews, African Americans, and usually white women who were associated with African Americans, like I said. As I talked before, Mr. Franklin was all over the U.S. by Salt Lake City to Pennsylvania to Missouri. He would kill. He was highly resourceful and really smart. He would often first visualize what would happen, where he was stationed, of how to get out, like how to not get caught. He was really smart, and like I said, he would always think about an escape plan, and one of them, which this unfortunately got him caught the first time. What I mean by the first time was Mr. Franklin, there was a car behind Mr. Franklin's car that would not move, I guess. He called the police station 3 times, which, sir, you have rifles in your back car. Why would you call the police, Because that's how cautious. He was very paranoid. I forgot to mention that. He was very paranoid and cautious. So he would end up calling the police. The police came, and police noticed rifles in his back, in his trunk. They arrest him, and surprise, surprise, it was the person that they were trying to find for the Liberty Park killings, along with 2 other crimes. Now, as they interviewed Mr. Franklin, he did not confess. He did not confess. He was not willing to comply with the investigators. So when the investigator went out of the interrogation room, he went out the window. He went out the window, which was wow. Again, the police and the FBI were on the hunt for Mr. Franklin. They didn't find Mr. Franklin until until around the 1980s, early 1980s, the early 1980s or late 1970s. He was under a different name. Like I said, Mr. Franklin was very cautious, so he would often use disguises and fake IDs. He was good with guns because that was his signature. But not only was he good with his guns, after Mr. Franklin was caught, he was put in many trials, and along those trials and charges, he ended up confessing to a number of crimes. He ended up confessing to the Liberty Park killings, to a bombing as well, which was highly interesting because you would think he'd only be a sniper, but no, he was also a bomber. He ended up bombing a house. Unfortunately, the dog didn't make it. However, the people that he was targeting ended up making alive. And in the book, there was a quote when he said, "It's such a shame that they didn't die," because for him, he wasn't sexually aroused by killings or anything like that. No, it was about the missions and how he needed to finish them, and it would be a failure if the victims didn't die. So there are a whole bunch of trials. There are a whole bunch of trials, and he ends up getting charges for, I believe, 3 killings. But the more he confessed, some of his killings didn't work with the evidence that the case was given. So the stories didn't align. That's what basically happened. The court issued an execution on November 9th. Mr. Franklin was the age of 63. He was executed in 2013 around 6 p.m. I believe. He was injected with 5 grams of pentobarbital, I believe. It took 10 minutes for Mr. Franklin to die. This concludes most of the book. Again, it talks about Mr. Franklin's upbringing, the amount of murders and confessions, and then murders and confessions, as well as why he thought the way he did. I forgot to mention, the FBI, Joseph Douglas, had interviewed Mr. Franklin before he was executed around the 1990s, I think, and he would justify his killings because it was God's saying, and he didn't feel remorseful at all towards his victims. So yeah, that basically concludes our book talk. Thank you for listening to this book talk. Yeah.